I had recently a conversation with a senior colleague who said this phrase that has stayed with me for some time, where he said, "Blessed be the young, for they inherit the national debt." And this, has made me think about what kind of future awaits us, what sort of institutions will govern us, what sort of values will dictate the way states and individuals interact with each other, what sort of systems will be in place. And I think a key component in this discussion is the institutional framework, including the United Nations, the UN Charter, international law, and so forth. And we have a brilliant panel ahead of us to discuss all the various aspects of this question, moderated by Sven Jurgensen, the former Estonian Perm Rep to the United Nations in New York. Sven, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will perhaps first introduce the panel and then have a short introduction, and then we get going. But before I do this, I have to say, you can't imagine how thrilled I am to see Kelly and Martin after such a long period. We were together in the Security Council, and we had fantastic relations over there at the time. We were just discussing before coming in that probably these times are over in the Security Council, because in my time the relations were really perfect on personal level. But the panel here is Her Excellency Kelly Craft, who was the 30th US Ambassador to the United Nations from 2019 and 2021. Then Martin Kimani, our colleague from Kenya, who is now Executive Director of the Center of Internations Cooperation, and who was the Ambassador of Kenya to United Nations from 2020 to 2024. And finally, Kristīne Līce, Legislation and International Law Advisor to the President of Latvia, and Latvia's representative to the International Human Rights Organization. I hope I was correct with all of that. So, starting off, what is the background of what we have and where we are? After the calamity of the First World War, with a proposal, the brainchild of American President Woodrow Wilson, League of Nations was created. Even though for some political reasons, the United States did not join itself, but the purpose of the organization was very simple: never again. Now, League of Nations, with German and Russian occupation of Poland in 1939, failed in only about 20 years. After the Second World War, a new effort was made. A new organization was created called United Nations with the same aim: never again. And if you look at what's happening in today's world, are we on the verge of another failure in the main purpose of the organization? When Estonia came out of Security Council in January 2022, we put in already our next candidature, thinking that when Germany is there every 8 years, Ireland every 20 years, maybe a country of the size of Estonia should be there every 30 years. So we put in the candidature to 2050, and at the time we were just joking among ourselves that hopefully, it seems such a long time, from 2022, that hopefully the organization is still there. At the time it was a joke. I think looking at the situation now, I think it's not funny anymore, because we really do not know. Now, United Nations has been successful in many fields, but protecting the Charter and international law, as United Nations does not have an army, they have only been successful in getting small countries and regional conflicts, to abide to Charter. But if a permanent member of Security Council violates UN Charter, there is nothing to do, and that's what they're seeing. And I will quote, for me at least, the most important article in the UN Charter, where when you listen to that, I think there is absolutely no question that it's just blatantly violated. And it's Article 2.4, and it says, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. I think there is no question it's the most blatant violation of UN Charter that is committed by a permanent member of Security Council. But unfortunately, permanent members have veto right. So the question is, therefore, are we doomed? What can we do? And our former president, Lennart Meri, has once said, international law is the nuclear weapon of small states. Big countries have power, they have military, they have, but small countries' existence relies on international law. And so I will start off with a question of, what do you think about the future of international law and UN Charter? Does the world order that was created after the Second World War, will it survive? And what could we do to rescue it? Or even also, or am I too fatalistic asking this? And let's kick off with Kelly.
So just a little bit about my background. Before I took the post at the United Nations, I was the ambassador to Canada. So it was a little bit of a different situation with, but at the same time, it had a lot of similarities because Trudeau and Trump, there was absolutely no love lost there. So I felt like going into the Security Council, I was ready to negotiate, albeit at a different level. And being there in 2019 and then sitting here today, when the United States was the president of the Security Council during my time, I took all of the Security Council members, minus 2 that were not able to be there, to Kentucky. Can you imagine that? The Russian, the Chinese, we were all together. And we had dinners together. We had a bourbon barrel pick, which is when everyone tastes bourbon and then you vote. We actually voted unanimously on a barrel of bourbon, which we all have. I think you're still enjoying your... So the difference now is you would never have the Chinese and the Russian ambassador, and at that time, most of those countries would have never, they would have not taken the trip had they known the Russian or the Chinese ambassadors would have been in there. So I think the world order is basically, it's changed. I feel as if the Security Council has been paralyzed by Russia. There has to be a change within the United Nations. I'm a believer in the United Nations because I feel as if for small countries, it's their only platform, it's their only opportunity to actually obtain what the Charter is all about. And that is humanity and peace and security, and also the UN, the sustainable goals. It's their only opportunity to have a voice. So there has to be a change. I feel as if we have to be careful, the countries that are being talked about, India, Japan, 2 of the countries in Africa. I feel a little bit unsettling about the 2 countries in Africa because of the stronghold that China and Russia has on these countries. How do we know that once again we're going to have 2 countries that are always going to vote their way? We had that issue when we were on the council with the border in Syria, trying to make certain that the Russians, who were adamant about not keeping the borders open, they had the 2 African countries that were, the elected members voting their way. So there has to be a change. I'm not quite certain how to go about that because it is such a long-standing institution. But I will quote the Latvian president. I was watching his address to the United Nations, and he said the United Nations once used to be a beacon of hope for the people. Not anymore. We must change that. We must rebuild trust and common values, and we can do this by working together. So he just said that at UNGA 2024. So how do we work together? How do we get to that point?
Thank you, Kelly. And before I give the word to the microphone to Martin, you remember, Martin, the night when it all started, there was a late night session of Security Council, and I have to say, you, Martin, gave, for me at least, the best speech I had ever heard at the United Nations. bringing it actually to the UN principles and bringing it also a parallel to Africa. How if the same logic, how the borders were drawn in Africa by the colonizers, and if this logic that Russia is using in Ukraine would apply to Africa, what a disaster it would be. So I'm very grateful to you, and during this session, late night session under Russian presidency actually, when Vasily, the Russian ambassador, started off ironically saying, you know, it's all propaganda, there is going to be no war, and then suddenly news came in, it started. But Martin, to you now, what do you think of the present situation of UN principles, of the UN Charter, international law, and what could we do to make it better? We don't hear you.
Thank you very much, Sven, and it's great being here. I wish I was in Riga with you. I will say, I don't think the UN has ever been where necessarily hope lies. I think international cooperation has happened outside the UN and has been codified and expressed at the UN. The UN gives hope because it's the collecting point for solidarity and trust that is built outside. The UN in 1945 was not being developed to be a decolonization organization, and yet that's what it became because of the kind of international cooperation that happened against colonialism. So it's not just the failures we have in New York or the shortcomings, it's that there's shortcomings of cooperation all over the world. On that night, Sven, that I remember so well, in February 2022, the days that followed had the whole world rallying to condemn the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The votes in the General Assembly were so clear and so overwhelming. The countries that had previously trampled on international law and on the basic tenets of the Charter were on this side of the fence speaking up for the Charter. And it appeared for a moment that we had a global consensus with an act of aggression by Russia on one side and everybody else, or almost everybody else, every other state on this side, speaking up for the Charter. There was hardly a speech I heard in the weeks after February 2022 that did not invoke the need to protect the UN Charter. Now, a year after the brutal, illegal, and inexcusable Hamas attack on Israel, that consensus is shattered. And it's shattered because of the silence, I'll be clear, the silence of Europe. The same standards that were being invoked in February 2022 are no longer invoked when it comes to Gaza or Lebanon. And this, whether people think it's only that there's inconsistency or they believe it's hypocrisy, either way, today the Charter and its defenders lie in divided camps. And we have to face up to that. And I think Europe needs especially to face up to it. And that's why I was so eager to attend this panel to say something that I've been wanting to say to my European friends. You're not going to have your cake and eat it too. Europe needs solidarity. Europe needs trust. But you're not going to be able to have trust by rallying to principle in one situation and keeping silent about principle in another. And I know that's a broad brush I'm using. And I also know that all diplomats, including myself in my former life, have our double standards. So I'm not on a high horse. I'm just saying, at a time when Europe needs the solidarity of the world, I believe Europe needs to repair its relationship with Africa. It needs to have a new vision for a relationship based on solidarity, and it needs to face the fatal flaw in Europe's policies when it comes to Africa that undermine its position on so many other things. Its immigration policy, the embrace of openly racist far-right politics that are spreading in Europe that have African people as the enemies of Europe's progress. Yet Europe is suffering demographic collapse, lack of economic competitiveness. It is Europe's capital, Europe's resources, Europe's technology, joined with African demography and natural resources that can allow the two of us to rise together and to have a two-way solidarity. But right now, the vision in Europe and the vision in Africa are both lacking this boldness. And that's why the UN Charter is going to be very difficult to defend because of lack of cooperation between Europe and Africa. If we did, between us, I think we would do a pretty good job of defending the Charter.
Europe has to get its act together, and Europe has to work together with Africa. That brings us to the future. But on the subject of Middle East, that's always been a painful thing for European Union, because European Union is trying to have common policy, usually trying to have a voting pattern that is unique and everybody doing the same. But this is one of the issues where it's pretty much always there is a three-way split inside European Union. There has never been a consensus on this issue. We're working on it, but we'll have to see how it works out. But you mentioned, Middle East. We've talked about Ukraine already. But if something like that and the devaluation of the UN principles and UN Charter is continuing, then we will face a conflict, the danger in Korea. We see what's happening around Taiwan. And so finally, we might end up in a global catastrophe. But Kristīne, what is your view on what we are talking now about the UN Charter and the future of it?
Thank you. First of all, privileged to be here. It's a fascinating discussion, and I look forward to it. First, I'd like to offer a view on UN Charter, and I propose to see it as performing two functions. First of all, it establishes what I would call the material of international rules. It's UN's purpose, UN's principles, and that's something we live by. The second function that the Charter does, it creates procedures and institutional architecture for monitoring, for enforcing those principles to achieve the purpose. I think that it shouldn't be challenged in any way that the principles of United Nations are existential for survival of all states. You can compare it with, traffic rules that need to be abided by so that we can all survive in the very complex traffic of, for example, a big city. And I think it's also symptomatic that you don't hear states talking about wanting to leave the United Nations, because being in the United Nations, being at the table, gives legitimacy, gives the proof that it is a state that is recognized by other states. In other words, it means that the state is a player in this global system. At the same time, it doesn't mean that the procedures and architecture are perfect. They're far from that. And throughout this conference, we've heard that the reforms have been going on almost endlessly. Sven mentioned that the momentum has been there for 15 years, and it doesn't seem to be ending in anytime soon. But I'd like to say that, in my view, the UN, flawed as it is, currently is the only insurance against erosion of the universality of those principles that, in the first place, ensured the existence of the state. That is not to say that there can't be regional cooperation. There has to be regional cooperation as long as it amplifies the principles of the UN. In other words, the Charter has to be defended by all means possible, The way we do that depends on us, the member states. I think it's also important that we as member states don't hide behind the name of United Nations as if it's something autonomous, and as if it can do something that the member states are not ready to allow it to do. So I haven't lost hope. I served both in Latvia's representations into the UN, both in Geneva and New York. I've seen the impact the UN has had on individual lives. Would the world be better without the UN? No, it wouldn't. Is the UN perfect? Obviously not, but it needs to be there, and it's entirely up to us to make it useful.
Thank you. You, Martin, touched upon it, and we were also talking about the broader division in the world, like when you have European problems, African problems, and so on. What I have seen recently, there seemed to be a game of words and terms that I really don't like. And it shows, that they, when you look at the substance, it's very different from the words themselves. First of all, I remember how 6 or 7 years ago, when the Russians started vocally protesting, when people were talking about rules-based world order, and they said, "Who created the rules?" And we can only talk about international law, no rules. Now, if you think about it, international law, I just quoted, for me, the most important article in the UN Charter, and I don't see any difference. You break the rules, you break the law, you do all of it. But the other two terms where I take opposition to is, one of them is when Russia is saying that the global West is fighting against them. Then if you think about the global West, South Korea is part of it, Japan is part of it, Australia is part of it. How come this is global West? It's basically democratic countries, but it would be difficult for Russia to say that the democratic countries are against us, because it sounds very bad. So they have created a new term. But where I'm getting to is the last term that I take offense with, is global South.
Yes.
And my question to you, Martin, is, how do you take this? Because if you think about the global South, what is it? Basically, it's it's come into use. Like if there would be two camps, one is the global West, the other is Russia, China, Iran, and then there is the global West. For me, it would sound even degrading. If you look at Africa, there's such different countries over there. You can't lump them together and call them global South. But what is your view on that, Martin?
I think the West is just as much of a geopolitical illusion as the global South. I think the global South, you're right, is full of inconsistencies. There's such differences, but it's a political construct that takes up where Third World left off. If you can remember Third World before it became a pejorative term, the non-aligned movement. So the global South is not without a historical basis. Now, the rise of this term global South or non-aligned movement is a direct reaction to the construct of the West. So it's pretty difficult, Sven, for people in the global South to hear people from the West decry the existence of a global South, because what is the West? Is it a racial construction? What is it exactly? Is it a cultural commonality? What cultural commonality could that be? Is it Christendom? Well, then surely it should be more expanded. Look, I don't think the solutions to the problems we have in defending the Charter are in these massive confrontations. I think, let me step a little bit back from Europe, Africa, because that requires levels of visionary leadership that frankly are nowhere to be seen. I think where we could benefit in our cooperation is in defending international humanitarian law together, and especially humanitarian access. If Sven and Kelly, you will remember in the Security Council, that when you're unable to actually take action to resolve a conflict, what you're left with is the chance to at least offer some relief to the people who are caught in the crossfire of armed groups and armed states. And right now, international humanitarian law and humanitarian access is not only being blocked, it's being turned into an instrument of war. This is happening in Sudan, it's happening in Gaza, and it is accelerating. Humanitarian workers are no longer just collateral damage, but are actually targets. Now, here is one specific issue that I think the whole world can rally around and actually renew and re-strengthen our political commitment to international humanitarian law and humanitarian access specifically. You do not need to support one side or the other for us to stand there together. And I think that, for me, is something I'm hoping at the UN and outside the UN can receive our urgent attention, because that's a red line. And the moment we break that red line, as we're doing repeatedly in Sudan and Gaza, we will enter an age of true barbarity.
Yeah, well, I'm going to take a little turn just because I have to say that I was just looking at the UN budget. That's something that was a bone to pick every day with the Secretary General and the UN in general. The United States, the last year we were able to get the full assessment was 2022. We are above 18 billion in assessments and voluntary. And yet, China is more engaged within the UN system, whether it be with the Aviation Committee, whether it be with the Food and Agriculture Committee. They are more engaged. The Human Rights Council basically has individuals on there that are the ones that are committing the atrocities themselves. So and then speaking about the Global South, I think from my perspective of the Global South, I think you deserve better than to be called the Global South. Is that where you were coming from? Because I wanted to make sure that Marta knew that that's where we were coming from. I'm offended by the term the Global South, and I know that it changes, but I think there needs to be something that is stronger and that doesn't differentiate between the West, the Global South, the Global North. But just as the United States, as the ambassador, as someone who needed to see more transparency, more accountability, it's not there. And some of the very countries that we speak about are the ones that are committing atrocities and crimes, are the ones that are keeping borders closed, are the ones that are keeping the humanitarian needs from meeting the needs of the people who actually are in the crossfire. And I have been traveling a lot just recently, just back from Taipei, meeting with their new president. And my message, I was not there to coddle them because I am a friend. And my message to them is you need to look at Russia and Ukraine. You need to get your house in order. Because you no longer have to be wary of China, but you've got to look at Iran, you've got to look at Russia, you've got to look at North Korea. You have now to look at the countries that China's going to call their chips in. I don't think the United Nations understands globally that we are literally on an edge. What are we going to do when when China invades Taiwan? And I think that's why we look at Japan. We were talking in the green room. We look at Japan joining the Security Council. I was just there 6 months ago, and they have raised their defense budget because they understand the threat. They will be the largest defense budget in the world. Nobody asked them to do so. They have their own NATO with the countries that understand that with Taiwan, if Taiwan's attacked, that's their line of defense. So I think as a whole, we all need to wake up. And it's just not the EU, it's the Americans. It's if you want to call it East, West, South, North, it's everyone. Because the world has been watching the way the US has responded to Russia, Ukraine. That all happened when we pulled out of Afghanistan, which was such a disaster. And now we have this threat. with China, Taiwan, and we're not paying attention. And it's not necessarily I'm asking people to be pro-Taiwan, but I'm asking them to look and wake up to see what China is infiltrating within the United Nations system. I mean, I can tell you that the United Nations sits on 18 acres, I believe, in Turtle Bay. It's called Turtle Bay. And you know Donald Trump, the former president, was such a real estate magnate. Can you imagine what he's thinking, what he could do with that prime real estate? We got to wake up. Because when he's reelected, the UN's going to be one of the topics. And the US should not carry the weight and the burden when there's no legitimacy. I mean, I could go on and on. You look at the Human Rights Council, there's no legitimacy when you have Iran, when you have China, when you have North Korea. Both of those countries, Iran and North Korea, chaired a committee.
It is a big problem.
Big problem.
And I think a problem also is when you look, like I said at the very beginning, I hate both those terms, global West and global South. But we kind of understand what is meant by them, even though the words are wrong. But I think also the problem at the moment is when United Nations is not ideal, and it can't be ideal because the world is not ideal, and it reflects the world that we live in. But I think a big problem also is I don't see right now real leadership, because United Nations itself cannot lead. It's a collective organization, but we do need a leadership that hopefully and perhaps can also deal with what you, Martin, were saying about this global West and global South, how this actually is misused. But what is your view, Kristīne, on that?
I think the Latvian history has taught us a very important lesson that peace and security is not an event, it's a process, which requires constant engagement. And to respond to what you just said about the leadership, I hope, at least in small areas, Latvia is leading by example, because we are increasingly engaging in strengthening the rules that we know, again, guarantee our existence. I'd like to think that we've left behind the years where we were just one issue country, so to speak, and that we're able to recognize the important issues faced by various regions, from climate change to sea level rise, to the challenges of that, to the statehood of small island states. And we want to show that we are ready to engage on all those issues because we care about their impact on the world. And by showing that, I hope it also shows that we are ready to assume ownership of this global order and make it as effective and as strong as possible, because if not us, those states that are committed to the UN principles, then who? UN as an organization, as you just mentioned, it's not something different to what we make it to be. And if we don't step up and shape it to in a way that we are committed to sovereign equality to states and non-interference in internal affairs, then there's a great danger that it will collapse. So I hope that Latvia will be able to sustain this engagement and increase it, and that will also speak to the cooperation and engagement with all regions. And I agree that the term Global South is at least misleading. I assume that there was an attempt to find a neutral term, and it seems that geography and coordinates of the compass offer that, but apparently not. There's too much diversity to put everything under one label. But I fully subscribe to cooperation across all the regions that strengthen the global order.
Thank you.
Can you talk about the sustainable goals? And don't you think if we focused on the UN Charter on peace and security, then the sustainable goals might be something that we actually could accomplish?
Absolutely.
And I think that they're so focused on the sustainable goals. If you remember, we all had the same pen, right? We were so focused on this that you lose if you don't have peace and security. You cannot achieve the sustainable goals. Mm-hmm. And I also wanted to say thank you to Latvia, because you have been standing so strong with Ukraine, and you have allowed them through the Black Sea. You have allowed them to be able to have their grain transports. And without Latvia, without the Baltic states, without Finland, I don't know where Ukraine would be today. And the EU has really stepped up. And I understand, Martin, I understand your concern with Israel and the Palestinian state, but that's a different issue altogether. That is Hamas. This is a country invading, a Security Council country invading innocent people.
So
Look,
please, Martin.
I really think we need to understand that the world is no longer going to go along with an old game that has failed repeatedly. We need a new period. We do. Now, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I recall after the speech that Kenya made, we got a lot of positive reactions for it. A number of older, experienced diplomats told me, you were wrong, because you seem to be siding with the West. And we said, no, we are standing on principle. Then what happened? African students started trying to flee Ukraine. They were treated abominably. On the borders of Ukraine, they were calling our delegation to find ways to be let into safety. They were being treated in ways that were so patently and brutally racist. And I had to call my US counterpart, Linda, to ask her to call her counterparts and officials in those countries to let in Kenyan citizens who are trying to flee Ukraine to their safety. When you look at the Mediterranean, it's full of African bodies because of Europe's migration policy. I am not here to try and understand why anti-immigration and anti-African immigration and refugees is so appealing to European voters, but it is. And so these are not sideline issues. These are not minor issues compared to Taiwan or Ukraine or any of these other issues that are considered very important by the West. These are our lives. And I am telling you here, as a friend, that it doesn't matter you decrying the term Global South or the construct. We are in a different period, and there's going to be an increasing assertion of different interests, as I've just mentioned, and Europe is either going to embrace them or resist them. And the choice is yours. But the more you resist them, the more common cause is made with your foes, who are clever enough to understand that our history is so fraught with negativity, so fraught with ill will, that they can easily exploit it with all kinds of lies and misinformation, and it will work. That is why I'm saying Europe needs solidarity and trust. And you're not going to get that solidarity and trust on single issue politics. It's going to require leadership. And I know this is not a message that many people want to hear. And I don't deliver it as a foe of the West. I actually deliver it as a friend of Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania. When I came to the UN, one of the things that made me really puzzled was how close the experiences of countries like Estonia were to countries like Kenya. We had both tasted the bitter fruit of domination by an imperial power. But to watch us relate to each other was at such a great distance. It's almost as if you had forgotten that we too had suffered like you. And you were standing on principle, on the very principles we are standing on, but we had no common purpose. And we didn't have a common purpose because many European countries refuse to see that their own suffering matches that of other people, and that there are ways we need to show solidarity with each other. And here I'm not talking about aid packages. I'm talking about a profound recognition of the value of each other's lives and histories. And that's why the solidarity is not coming. And that's why there's a global South.
I hear you, Martin, but I think what you just said proves that the people saying that you were wrong were wrong. I think that what you're saying is proving you're right, because when something is unacceptable, it should be unacceptable everywhere. And Europe is fighting with its own demons. And the right-wing populism that you are referring to is really a huge problem that we have to face in so many different countries. But it's probably the fragile situation in the world that is bringing us to that. And like the people are saying, you know, foreign policy is an extension of internal policy, politics. And so therefore, I think it also goes the other way around. You can see the connection over there. But we have agreed that we do have a problem. We do have a problem with UN Charter, with the situation of human rights, of a situation of humanitarian situation in the world, in different regions. Now, one way to do this is we should reform the system. But the problem is what I find, and I'm glad that actually both me and Martin and Kelly, we are not in the government at the moment, we can speak a bit more freely than we could otherwise. And I said at another panel yesterday, you know, I don't see a meaningful UN or UN Security Council reform as possible. Because how the UN was created in 1945, it also made it impossible to reform because there are 5 countries with a veto right, and of course they are not interested in losing it, and so the main problems that we see cannot be eliminated. That was my viewpoint. Do you agree with me? Is there something that we can do? And there are 2 reforms, the UN reform and Security Council reform. And is there something that we can do? Let's start with you, Kristīne.
I'll start by saying that the fact that up until now the reform hasn't been successful is not a proof that it's impossible or the reason not to keep trying. I share the caution about immediate and great success, but I'm also not entirely pessimistic. I think that there are perhaps smaller steps that can be done that I hope will accumulate and have a greater impact. Again, I'll refer to history of Latvia that has recently been described in an excellent book by a Latvian scholar called, the book's title is Politics of Uncertainty. It's about Latvia's restoration of Latvia's independence and the triangle of relations between United States, Soviet Union at that time, and the Baltic states. And the message from that book is very clear that when that very unique moment in time comes, when the stars align and the constellations appear that something can be done, we need to be ready for that. I know the same sentiment has been already voiced in this conference both yesterday and today. So I do believe that change is possible, that the reform is possible, but it's same as the effectiveness of the United Nations. It depends on the willingness of the states to do that. And I think by smaller steps, great results can be achieved. We spoke before the Liechtenstein's initiative on veto initiative that has created, I won't use the word pressure, but an ecosystem for veto power to be used according to the Charter, but with an added responsibility towards the wider membership of the United Nations. I think it's a valuable initiative, and I hope it will prove its value, even greater value in the future. So I'm cautious but optimistic.
How do you see it, Kelly?
I think just the fact that we are having the discussion, because during my tenure, everyone was very pessimistic. So I think that is the opening of the discussion, the fact that the Secretary General is actually looking into ways. But how can anything be changed when the same 5 countries have veto power, no matter who you bring in? And my biggest concern is, yes, I think Japan deserves to be in the Security Council. If you look at what they're doing with their defense budget and you look at what they're with their economy, India, if you just look at the size. But the 2 countries in Africa, which I think also, but with China and the way that China and Russia are wrong about going into, and I understand, Martin, it's probably because the European countries and the US didn't get there fast enough with our development fund, international development fund. So I'm not blaming the countries in Africa. I'm just saying the way that China has taken advantage strategically with countries that have minerals rights or their ports, and then the way the Russians have come in with their security, whether it be the leftover Wagners or whatever group it may be. How do we know that they are not going to be then owned by China and Russia when it comes to important votes? That's my biggest concern. And until we can change the veto power, I don't see there being anything other than 2 additional members to the Security Council.
Martin, what do you think?
Sven, there was a time I had a chance to ask President Uribe of Colombia what reforms he had made to his office so as to undertake this famous recovery of Colombian governance. And I was doing that as a Kenyan civil servant because I was an enthusiast in reforms of how our presidency worked. And so I wanted some ammunition for my quest. And he told me none. And I have come over time to believe that when the cries for reform are loudest, it's because leadership is lacking. And therefore, diplomats who have to do something and say something and be busy negotiating something begin to negotiate for reforms. But what they're doing is covering up the giant vacuum of leadership. I'm not saying that reforms are not necessary to the Security Council. They are. But at this point, I don't want to waste so much time discussing them. I would rather discuss where is the level of leadership that we need. Where is the bold enough leadership we need within the UN and in the major countries that lead UN action? And unfortunately, after 4 years in New York, watching different delegations, what I found was a lack of leadership masquerading as a desire for reform and narrow, self-interested transactional politics when visionary, bold policies were needed. Where will this leadership come from? I don't know. But one thing I do know is that the voters of Europe, the voters of democratic countries in Africa, including my own, need to begin to deliver the kind of leadership the world needs right now. Reform is important. Leadership is what we need.
I agree. And I'm just starting to think now, listening to it, what is unique and interesting at the United Nations. When we speak about leadership in the world, we usually look up to big countries. But at United Nations, leadership can be taken by small and tiny countries. What you mentioned, this initiative, veto initiative, the leader was Liechtenstein. And so these kinds of things, and when we look at the election process of the Secretary General, where we had first time we had a democratic elections with official candidates and several candidates, a completely transparent voting and system. It was Estonia and Costa Rica who were doing it. So I think, what is your view, Martin, also coming from the African continent? Can we find the leadership among smaller countries, or do we still have to look up to either bigger countries or bigger organizations or units like European Union or African Union, or can it be taken up by just individual smaller countries?
Well, right now, I find that the richest countries lack a lot of bandwidth. So many of the problems, for instance, going on in the Horn of Africa have a lot to do with US inattention. There was a time the US had a huge footprint, for good and bad. And the withdrawal of that footprint, because frankly, of lack of bandwidth, has now made a lot of smaller countries have a lot more room to play different positive and negative games in the Horn of Africa. So I think this is a time when the so-called middle powers need to rally together. I actually think this is a time when we don't have to depend on just a few of the superpowers. When we were in the Security Council, Sven, you will recall that as the conflict in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine happened, and that paralysis happened on that file, it immediately gave the elected 10 and different countries within the elected 10 different opportunities to have a lot more influence in the council. And that's why I was saying it's so important right now for there to be conversations between the people who are living under the threat of Russian aggression, such as many who are in this room, to have conversations with well-meaning Africans and Asians and South Americans. And we have to do that not just on issues around aggression. We have to talk about international tax policy together. When the Africans bring a resolution on international tax reforms, and all the countries that I'm talking about vote with the OECD, and only Norway in Europe votes with the Africans, we have to begin to have more strategic conversations, because we are wasting so much opportunities to build trust with each other, because we're approaching it in a single issue way, in a very narrow way, that does not understand that solidarity does not come in one hand and when it's not there in the other. So this is a time for genuine and honest conversations. And that's why I may even have sounded a bit harsh, but my aim is to go beyond the normal way we discuss these issues and start to have very honest conversations with one another.
Don't you think that what's important is that the honest conversations start long before we're asking for votes? That the relationship, that I'm not just going to go to Niger, to our fellow Ambassador Abari, and say, I need your vote, when I have never just sat down with him to understand what are your needs. And that's
yes,
Kelly. I think that's a real problem. That's a real problem, is that the superpowers, when a new ambassador comes in, as you well know, you have a list of countries that you are going to visit upon your arrival. And those countries are the superpower countries, right? Well, I as ambassador, I saw a little differently. I was scolded for this, but my relationship with the African countries, 6 months before Russia threatened to close the two borders, if you remember this whole debacle, they voted with us. They would have never done that had I suddenly, the day before or 2 days before, introduced myself. I think it's a huge mistake in the UN that we take for granted smaller countries. Because I will tell you now, I think that they are of great importance within the UN General Assembly. Because there's more
really
of them
important.
than there are of us. Excuse me?
Sorry to interrupt. Please go ahead.
No, I think that it's vitally important that we don't develop a relationship on the basis of I need your vote. Instead, what do you need?
Let me just say, I voted with Ukraine. I did not vote because of America. And it's a really crucial distinction. I did not vote because Linda asked me to vote. I voted because of our conscience as a country. And in fact, because of the confusion between these two categories of voting, we came in for a lot of stick because we were seen as, quote unquote, siding with the West. Mm-hmm. You're not going to fight for the UN Charter by siding with the West. You're only going to succeed in fighting for the UN Charter by fighting for the UN Charter. And the West and the United States is also going to need some amount of restraint on the basis of the Charter. It cannot be that the Charter is good enough for everyone, but not good enough for you. And it cannot, you are the ones, the United States is the most crucial country in defending the Charter. The moment the US stands with the Charter, then we have half a chance of the world order being orderly and lawful. But it cannot be a menu. And African countries are not there to just give their concerns and their needs. They need to show the guts and the principle to stand up for international law and the Charter. And when we do, we shouldn't do it because we were either in a friendly way convinced to do it or intimidated into doing it, because that is not a real defense of the Charter. The 141 votes Ukraine got, those were genuine votes. I don't think arms needed to be twisted. And that's what we need.
Thank you, and I agree with you again. I think if UN Charter becomes a menu, then countries like mine will be on the menu. And that's why I think for us it can't be. It has to be taken as it is. And international law, like I said earlier, is our nuclear weapon. This is our deterrence. This is the basis for our existence. But we have 2 minutes left. And maybe just very quickly, just with a few sentences for all of you to wrap it up. You mentioned pessimist and optimist. I think we talked also earlier before you came in. I think it depends very much on your expectations. If you expect to have an ideal world, an ideal organization, then everybody becomes pessimist because it doesn't work. But there are many positive things to the United Nations. But the prediction and what I would like you to put together, looking at the dangers in the world, we are looking, I mentioned earlier, Ukraine, Middle East, Taiwan, Korea, all those potential clashes that we see the blatant violation of UN Charter that devalues the Charter, therefore. What is a prediction of what will happen? I said earlier when I introduced it, our joke of 2050, whether the seat is still there waiting for us. And I cannot say it now with 100% because of the real dangers that we are facing. But let's have a quick round. We have 1 minute. Just pessimist or optimist?
Optimist. I think multilateralism has the potential of becoming an exercise in empathy, that we are able to see beyond our immediate needs and see those of the others. The alternative is regionalization and perhaps erosion of what I spoke earlier, of the universality of those norms. And I think that has a risk of creating arbitrariness, which inevitably leads to abuse. So again, for the states to survive, we need a framework of the United Nations and we need empathy.
Thank you. Kelly?
I think with what's going on in the world, with what has grabbed our attention, with Ukraine, with Israel, with China, Taiwan, with the latest with Hamas, with Sinwar's death, we can't forget what's going on in Sudan. We can't forget what's happening in countries today with the humanitarian needs. And I think I'm very optimistic. However, I'm more concerned about, are we allowing these large wars, these large conflicts? We cannot take our mind off of what's may not be so large and so sexy and so much in the media and talked about every day, but they will affect us. And I'm very concerned about some of the countries that we see, especially in Sudan, and a lot of the conflicts and the needs of Pacific Islands. But I can tell you, as a former Trump appointee and as someone who believes in the UN, it is a joke that we are the largest contributors. and the fact that we are not, as the UN, is not standing with peace and security. And as an American, I can't allow that. And if we are in office, if Donald Trump is elected, I can guarantee you that there's going to be some real conversations around, is the U.S. going to participate at this level? Because we have to go back to the basics, to the charter.
Martin, final word to you.
Yeah.
Pessimist or optimist?
I'm an optimist, but my optimism has to travel through fire before it's realized. Notice the sea change happening all over the world. From the Arab Spring to the color revolutions to the uprising in Sudan that overthrew a military dictatorship, young people are no longer willing to go along to get along with governing political classes in multiple countries that I think have had their day. And so many of the language we have at the UN are about older days and older hierarchies. And I find young people increasingly all over the world are looking for a revision of the terms of engagement. I think it is them who are going to lead us to a new re-energized United Nations. And even in the election that is coming here in the United States in a few weeks, there is such an counter elite energy that is looking to find its way in all kinds of ways. And I don't have a dog in the fight, but I do find citizens all over the world are no longer willing to listen to the same old stories. They want a change. And that's why there's an opportunity for a new class of politicians to rise, to harness that energy, and to find a new way to lead us in the UN. That's my optimism, but it's going to come with a lot of difficulty, a lot of negativity, and even a lot of conflict. But the underlying trend is towards transformation.
Thank you all so much for a great panel.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Kelly.